The daughter-in-law's revenge. A family cursed forever. In a village long forgotten, a bitter tragedy unfolded between a wealthy mother-in-law and her ill-fated daughter-in-law. Emily, a once gentle woman, married into the powerful family of Mrs. Wilkins, but after 8 long years of torment, her spirit shattered under the weight of cruelty and heartlessness. Mrs. Wilkins, blinded by pride and malice, treated Emily as less than human, driving her to an untimely death by hanging in her own room. But death did not grant Emily peace. Soon after, strange occurrences began to haunt the Wilkins household, each eerie event bringing with it the cold shadow of vengeance. In a harrowing night of rain and storm, Emily's vengeful spirit returned, her hollow eyes seeking justice for the years of suffering she had endured. Mrs. Wilkins, now stricken with terror and guilt, began seeing horrifying apparitions of her deceased daughter-in-law. These ghostly visits escalated into a terrifying climax as Emily's spirit sought retribution. The once proud matriarch's life unraveled in horrifying ways, leading to a terrifying conclusion as Emily's wrath consumed the Wilkins family. The tale is not just one of the supernatural, but a grim reminder of how cruelty and hatred can echo beyond the grave. Part 1. The Bitter Beginning. The wind howled through the old house, a house that once stood as a proud symbol of Mrs. Wilkins' rise to wealth. But now it seemed as though the very walls were groaning under the weight of the misery that had filled it for years. Outside, the sky darkened as a storm approached, the wind carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of something far worse. The storm brewing in the sky, however, was nothing compared to the storm that had been raging inside the Wilkins household for the past 8 years. Inside, the dimly lit hallway echoed with the sharp clicks of Mrs. Wilkins' heels as she marched down its length, her back straight and her chin held high. She had always carried herself with the air of someone who believed she had won the game of life, who had clawed her way from poverty to wealth by sheer force of will. Her eyes, cold and unyielding, scanned the house, searching for any sign of imperfection. But what she sought was not a dusty corner or a misaligned painting, it was Emily. Emily, her daughter-in-law, had married into the Wilkins family with hope in her heart, believing that this would be the beginning of a better life. But she soon learned that Mrs. Wilkins was not just a stern matriarch, she was a tyrant. Mrs. Wilkins had come from nothing, and she had let nothing soften her heart on the way up. Wealth had not brought her kindness or grace, only a deeper sense of entitlement. And Emily, unfortunately, had become the outlet for Mrs. Wilkins' frustrations. In the beginning, Emily had tried. Oh, how she had tried. She had come into the family with nothing but love and respect for her husband Henry and for his mother. She had hoped to win Mrs. Wilkins over, to prove herself a worthy wife and daughter-in-law. Emily had been kind, generous and dutiful, always eager to help, to cook, to clean. She had taken every harsh word and every cruel criticism with a smile, believing that if she just worked a little harder, showed a little more patience, Mrs. Wilkins would eventually accept her. But that day never came. Mrs. Wilkins had been hard on Emily from the moment she set foot in the house. She had criticized everything Emily did, from the way she cooked to the way she walked, even the way she breathed. Too loud she would hiss, like a dying animal. No matter how much Emily tried to please her, it was never enough. Mrs. Wilkins found fault in everything. Her eyes were always watching, always judging, waiting for Emily to make a mistake. "You're worthless, Mrs." Wilkins would say with a sneer, "A disgrace to this family. How my son ended up with you, I will never understand." Emily had learned to bite her tongue, to swallow the hurt and the tears that threatened to spill over each time Mrs. Wilkins lashed out at her. She had tried to remind herself that Mrs. Wilkins had had a hard life, that she had fought her way up from poverty, that she didn't mean the things she said. But after 8 long years, the hope that Emily had once clung to had faded into nothing. She was a shell of the woman she had once been, her spirit crushed under the weight of her mother-in-law's cruelty. Even Henry, her husband, had changed. Once a kind and loving man, Henry had grown distant, weary of the constant tension in the house. He had learned to avoid conflict with his mother by staying silent, by turning a blind eye to the suffering his wife endured. He had retreated into his work, leaving Emily to fend for herself against Mrs. Wilkins' unrelenting attacks. And so Emily was alone in the battle, with no one to defend her. The storm outside grew louder, rattling the windows, as if the wind itself was protesting the misery that filled the house. Inside, Emily sat at the edge of the bed in the small room she shared with Henry, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white from the pressure, her lips pressed together in a thin line to keep them from trembling. She stared blankly at the wall, the sound of Mrs. Wilkins' voice echoing in her mind, even in the moments of silence. "You'll never be good enough," Mrs. Wilkins' voice had hissed earlier that day. "No matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, you think you belong here? In this family, you're nothing, you'll always be nothing." The words had cut deep, as they always did, but this time there was no anger, no tears. Emily had stopped crying a long time ago. Now there was only numbness. She felt as though she were floating, detached from the pain, from the world around her. Her mind wandered back to the day she had first arrived at the house, so full of hope, so eager to start a new life. How naive she had been. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the rain had begun to fall in heavy sheets, streaking down the glass. She could see her own reflection, a pale, hollow version of herself, staring back at her. The person she had been was gone, and in her place was someone she barely recognized, a woman worn down by years of torment, a woman who had lost the will to fight. She heard the creak of the floorboards in the hallway and knew that Mrs. Wilkins was coming. The older woman made her presence known wherever she went, as if the very air around her recoiled at her approach. Emily braced herself, though she no longer had the energy to rise from the bed. The door swung open without a knock, and there stood Mrs. Wilkins, her sharp eyes narrowing as they fell on Emily. "Still sitting there like a useless lump? I see," Mrs. Wilkins said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Haven't you anything better to do than mope around all day?" Emily didn't respond. She had long since learned that arguing was pointless, that nothing she said or did would ever be enough for this woman. But her silence only seemed to infuriate Mrs. Wilkins further. "Look at you, Mrs." Wilkins sneered, stepping into the room. "You can't even bother to defend yourself anymore. No wonder Henry barely looks at you. You've become a ghost in this house, a ghost." The word echoed in Emily's mind. Yes, that was what she had become, wasn't it? A ghost of the person she had once been, trapped in a house that felt more like a prison with each passing day. She could feel the walls closing in around her, suffocating her, and yet she couldn't bring herself to move. Mrs. Wilkins leaned in closer, her voice a low hiss. "Do you think anyone would care if you disappeared? Do you think anyone would even notice?" The words hung in the air, heavy with malice. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. She had heard Mrs. Wilkins say cruel things before, but this was different. There was something darker behind those words, something sinister. Mrs. Wilkins straightened up, a satisfied smile playing on her lips as she saw the flicker of fear in Emily's eyes. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily alone once more with the storm and the echo of her words. "Do you think anyone would notice?" As the rain battered the window, Emily's gaze drifted again to the reflection in the glass. The woman staring back at her seemed even more distant now, her eyes hollow, her face pale and drawn. She had tried for so long to be strong, to hold on to the hope that things would get better. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Mrs. Wilkins had taken everything from her, her spirit, her hope, her very sense of self. And now all that remained was the unbearable weight of despair. The wind howled outside, and for a moment it sounded almost like a voice whispering, calling. Emily stood slowly, her movements mechanical, as though she were being guided by some unseen force. She walked to the window, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. The storm was growing stronger, the rain pelting down with increasing ferocity. But it wasn't the storm outside that terrified her. It was the storm within. Do you think anyone would notice? Emily turned away from the window and looked around the room. The room that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a tomb. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick and suffocating. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't escape. She was trapped not just in this house, but in a life that had become a living nightmare. And no one would notice if she disappeared. She crossed the room to the small closet, her hands trembling as she opened the door. Inside, hanging on a hook, was an old frayed rope. She stared at it for a long moment, her mind numb, her body moving on autopilot. She reached out and took the rope, her fingers curling around the rough fibers. It was as if the decision had already been made for her. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. But inside, the house was eerily silent, save for the soft creak of the floorboards as Emily climbed onto the chair and tied the rope to the beam above. Her hands were steady now, her heart calm. No one would notice. The storm outside drowned out the sound of the chair being kicked away. Part 2. Emily's final decision. The wind howled outside, a mournful wail that seemed to echo Emily's own torment. Rain lashed against the windows as if the heavens themselves were weeping for her. Inside, the house was quiet, oppressively so, like the air just before a storm breaks. The old wooden beams creaked under the weight of time, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, stretching like the fingers of something unseen, waiting to swallow her whole. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind a swirling mess of thoughts and emotions. Her heart was heavy, weighed down by years of suffering, years of enduring the cruelty of Mrs. Wilkins, her mother-in-law, who had made it her life's mission to break Emily's spirit. It had been 8 long years of harsh words, of venomous looks, of constant belittlement. 8 years of being told she was worthless, that she didn't belong in this family, that she would never be good enough. Every day Mrs. Wilkins had found new ways to chip away at Emily's soul, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of the woman she once had been. Then Henry, her husband. Once he had been her light, her hope, but now he was little more than a shadow in her life. He had withdrawn, leaving her to fend for herself against his mother's relentless cruelty. He said nothing when Mrs. Wilkins tore into her, offering no defense, no comfort. He had become a bystander in her suffering, watching in silence as his wife withered away under the weight of his mother's hatred. Emily had tried to hold on, to push through the pain and find some reason to keep going. She had hoped, foolishly, that one day things might change, that Mrs. Wilkins might soften, or that Henry might finally stand up for her. But deep down she knew that day would never come. The weight of her despair had become unbearable, crushing her under its relentless pressure. That night, as the storm raged outside, something inside Emily finally snapped. It was as if the last fragile thread of hope had been severed, leaving her adrift in a sea of darkness. She could no longer see a way out, no future, no escape from the hell she was living in. The only way to end her suffering was to end it all. She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her as if they could barely support the weight of her decision. She felt lightheaded, her mind numb, as though she were watching herself from a distance. Her body moved on autopilot, guided by some unseen force as she crossed the room to the closet. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed unnervingly in the silence. Inside, hanging from a hook, was an old, frayed rope, one that had been used to hang laundry in better times. But tonight it would serve a darker purpose. Emily stared at the rope for a long moment, her mind strangely quiet. There was no more fear, no more pain, just a cold, numbing sense of inevitability. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the rough fibers, feeling the coarse texture beneath her skin. It felt strangely comforting, like the final piece of a puzzle she had been trying to solve for years. With slow, deliberate movements, she took the rope down and began to tie a noose. Her hands worked methodically, the knot forming with practiced ease. She had never done this before, but somehow it felt like she had. The act was so simple, so mechanical, as if it were something she had always known how to do. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she tied the knot, but her heart was steady. There was no turning back now. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, the rain pounding against the window with increased fury. It was as if the world was screaming in protest, begging her not to go through with it. But Emily couldn't hear it. All she could hear was the sound of Mrs. Wilkins' voice echoing in her mind over and over again. "You're worthless. You don't belong here. No one would care if you disappeared." The words cut deep, even now, after all these years. They had been seared into her soul, etched into every fiber of her being. And in that moment, Emily believed them. No one would care. No one would notice. She dragged the chair from the corner of the room, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sound reverberated through the room like a final, desperate plea for attention, but there was no one to hear it, no one to stop her. She placed the chair beneath the ceiling beam and climbed onto it, her body feeling weightless, as though she were already floating away. The room seemed to tilt around her, the shadows closing in, but she didn't care. Nothing mattered anymore. Not the storm, not the house, not even the life she was about to leave behind. With trembling hands, Emily slipped the noose over her head, tightening it around her neck. The rope felt rough and cold against her skin, but it didn't matter. It wouldn't matter for long. She closed her eyes, her breathing slow and steady now. The storm outside raged on, but in the room there was only silence. A deep, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. For a moment, just a brief moment, a flicker of doubt passed through her mind. Was this really the only way? Would anyone miss her? Would Henry? But the thought was fleeting, drowned out by the weight of everything she had endured. The years of abuse, the constant barrage of cruelty, the isolation. It was too much. It had always been too much. With one final breath, Emily kicked the chair out from under her. For a second, there was nothing, just the sensation of falling, of the world dropping away beneath her. And then, the rope jerked tight around her neck, cutting off her air, her life. The pain was sharp, immediate, but it was over quickly. Her body swayed gently in the air, the storm outside continuing to rage as if nothing had happened. And then there was only darkness. When the sun finally rose the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside quiet and still. The house, too, was silent, but it was a different kind of silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press down on the walls, suffocating everything within. Mrs. Wilkins was the first to wake, her face twisted into its usual mask of disapproval as she shuffled down the hallway. The air in the house felt colder than usual, a chill that settled deep into her bones, but she ignored it. There were more important things to concern herself with: breakfast, the day's chores, keeping everything in perfect order. She paused outside Emily's room, her hand resting on the doorknob. A frown tugged at her lips as she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her froze her in place. Emily's body hung limply from the ceiling, swaying gently with the faint draft from the window. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted, her eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. But there was nothing peaceful about the scene. The rope, rough and frayed, bit into her neck, a cruel mark of finality. For a moment Mrs. Wilkins said nothing. She simply stood there staring, her breath caught in her throat. There was no scream, no gasp of horror, just a cold, numbing shock that settled over her like a heavy blanket. And then, slowly, a twisted smile curled at the corners of her lips. "Good riddance," she muttered, turning on her heel and walking away, leaving the door open behind her. In the days that followed, there was no funeral, no ceremony to mark Emily's passing. Mrs. Wilkins had the body buried quickly and quietly, as if she were disposing of an inconvenience rather than a person. Henry barely spoke a word, his face pale and drawn, but he too said nothing. Life, it seemed, would go on as it always had. But the house had changed. The silence that had once been a comfort to Mrs. Wilkins now felt suffocating, oppressive. She found herself hearing things, footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, whispers in the dead of night. The air felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't quite name. And sometimes, just out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a shadow, a figure standing in the doorway, watching her. But when she turned, there was nothing, just the wind and the sound of the rope still creaking gently in the darkness. Part 3. A Cold and Unrepentant Heart. The morning after Emily's death dawned grey and cold, as if the world itself had dimmed in response to the tragedy. But within the Wilkins household, there was no such mourning, no recognition of the life that had been so brutally extinguished. The walls stood silent, but the air within them seemed charged, almost alive with something sinister, something that Mrs. Wilkins, in her typical fashion, chose to ignore. The night had been stormy, but the next morning, the sun failed to break through the thick layer of clouds, casting a gloomy pall over the village. Outside, the world was drenched in rainwater, the streets slick and silent, while inside the Wilkins estate, the atmosphere was colder than it had ever been. Emily's body, still hanging in her room, was no longer a person but an inconvenience, a mistake that needed to be quickly cleaned up before it could soil the perfectly ordered world Mrs. Wilkins had crafted for herself. Mrs. Wilkins stood in the kitchen, her back straight and her face impassive, as though nothing had happened. Her sharp eyes glanced at the clock on the wall. Time had passed since she'd found Emily that morning, her lifeless body swaying gently from the ceiling beam. It had been a disturbing sight, perhaps to anyone else, but not to Mrs. Wilkins. She was above such trivialities as sympathy or grief. Pathetic, she had muttered under her breath, shaking her head as she turned away from the body. There had been no tears, no moments of stunned silence, no gasp of horror. There had been no room for that in Mrs. Wilkins' heart. She had only felt the briefest flicker of inconvenience. Emily's death meant a disruption to her routine, and Mrs. Wilkins despised disruptions. Everything in her world had to be perfectly in order, and Emily's act of selfish despair had left a stain on that order, if only momentarily. She had gone straight to the phone after discovering the body, calling the undertaker with brisk efficiency. "My daughter-in-law has passed," she had said, her voice cold and detached, as though she were informing the man of something as mundane as a fallen tree in the yard. "I need the body removed by this afternoon." And that was it. There was no need for further explanation. She hadn't mentioned how she had found Emily, or how the poor girl had hung herself in the dead of night. To Mrs. Wilkins, those details were irrelevant. They were beneath her concern. Emily had been weak, and weakness had no place in her household. As she prepared her tea, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Henry, her son, had not taken Emily's death well. He had been a mess when he found out, his face pale, his hands trembling. Mrs. Wilkins had watched him with mild disgust as he stumbled into the hallway that morning, still half asleep, and stared at her in confusion. "Mother, where is Emily?" he had asked, his voice thick with sleep. Mrs. Wilkins had raised an eyebrow. "Gone," she said flatly. "She's gone." Henry had blinked, his expression blank for a moment, before the reality of her words sank in. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "She took her own life," Mrs. Wilkins replied, with the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. "I found her hanging from the ceiling beam in her room this morning." Henry's face had drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to find the words, but none came. He had turned and staggered back down the hallway, his footsteps uneven, like a man in a daze. Now, as his footsteps approached the kitchen once again, Mrs. Wilkins sighed, annoyed at the thought of dealing with his grief. Grief was weakness, just like Emily. She had no patience for it. Her son, for all his strengths, had inherited none of her resilience. Henry entered the kitchen, his eyes red and swollen, his face ashen. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, though it had only been one night since Emily's death. His hand shook as he tried to pour himself a cup of tea, sloshing it onto the countertop. "Pull yourself together," Henry, Mrs. Wilkins snapped, watching him with disapproval. "There's no use in falling apart over something you can't change," Henry froze, his eyes wide and disbelieving. "How can you say that? Emily, she's dead. How can you act like it doesn't matter?" Mrs. Wilkins sighed, placing her teacup on the table with a deliberate clink. "It doesn't do to dwell on the dead. The girl was weak. She couldn't handle the pressures of this family. If she wasn't strong enough to survive, then perhaps it's better that she's gone." The words were harsh, callous even, but Mrs. Wilkins believed them. In her world, there was no room for sentimentality. Emily had been a burden, a constant reminder of imperfection in a house that demanded strength and order. Now, with her gone, perhaps things could finally settle back into the quiet, controlled existence Mrs. Wilkins craved. Henry stared at his mother in disbelief, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "She was my wife, Mother. She was your daughter-in-law. She was a nuisance," Mrs. Wilkins replied, her tone icy. "And now she's gone." There's nothing more to say. Tears welled in Henry's eyes, and he turned away, choking on his words. He couldn't bring himself to argue with her. He never could. Mrs. Wilkins' dominance over him was complete, and even now, in his grief, he was too afraid to challenge her. But something had changed in Henry. Though he was powerless to stand up to his mother, there was a fracture in him, a crack in the facade of the obedient son. Emily's death had broken something inside him. He felt as though a part of him had died with her, and now, standing in the cold, sterile kitchen, listening to his mother dismiss the woman he had loved, he knew that things would never be the same. The undertaker arrived in the early afternoon, just as Mrs. Wilkins had instructed. 2 men, dressed in black, carried Emily's body out of the house on a stretcher, her face covered with a white sheet. Henry watched from the doorway, his heart heavy, while Mrs. Wilkins stood by, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She gave no instructions for a funeral, no request for a service to honor Emily's life. There would be no mourning. Emily would be buried quickly, quietly, without fanfare, and life would go on. "Take her to the cemetery on the outskirts of town," Mrs. Wilkins said to the undertaker, her voice clipped. "I don't want to force. No service, no visitors. Just bury her and be done with it." The undertaker hesitated for a moment, glancing at Henry, who stood silent, tears streaking down his face. But Mrs. Wilkins' icy stare brooked no argument, and the men nodded, carrying Emily's body away without another word. As the car drove off, Henry stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his heart aching with the weight of everything he had lost. He felt as though the world had been ripped out from under him, and yet he couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to fight against the cold indifference of his mother. He was trapped, just as Emily had been. Mrs. Wilkins watched her son with barely concealed irritation. "Henry," she said sharply, "there's no need for this. What's done is done. Now pull yourself together. We have guests coming tonight." Henry turned slowly to face her, disbelief etched into his features. "Guests? Mother, Emily I don't care," she snapped. "Life goes on. We cannot allow ourselves to be held back by the past. We have obligations, and we will fulfill them. Now go wash up. I won't have you looking like a ghost when the king stays alive." Henry's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. What could he say? He was powerless against her, just as he had been all his life. Without a word, he turned and walked upstairs, his footsteps heavy, the grief settling deeper into his chest with each passing moment. Mrs. Wilkins watched him go, her lips pressed into a thin line. She would not tolerate this weakness. She had built her life, her reputation, on strength, on control, and she would not allow Henry's grief to disrupt that. Emily had been a mistake, a weakling, and she was gone now. That was the end of it. Or so Mrs. Wilkins thought, but as the days passed, something began to change in the house. It was subtle at first, a chill in the air, a creak in the floorboards, the faintest whisper of something just beyond hearing. Mrs. Wilkins dismissed it, attributing it to the old age of the house, but deep down, a part of her knew that something was wrong. Something had shifted the moment Emily died, and no amount of control could fix it. The night after Emily was buried, Mrs. Wilkins lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The house was silent, as it always was, but tonight the silence felt different. It was heavier, more oppressive, as though the air itself was pressing down on her. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but sleep would not come. Instead, she lay there, her mind wandering. Part 4. The first haunting. The cold air of the Wilkins house clung to the walls like a lingering breath, stale and oppressive. After Emily's death, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. Though Mrs. Wilkins had expected everything to return to normal, it was clear that something had changed. The air was thicker, the shadows darker, and there was an unsettling silence that followed her wherever she went, a silence that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible. At first, Mrs. Wilkins refused to acknowledge the strange occurrences that began almost immediately after Emily's burial. She had no patience for such nonsense. She was a woman of strength and logic, and the idea of being haunted by the ghost of her dead daughter-in-law was laughable, at least in the light of day. But at night, when the house settled into an eerie stillness, Mrs. Wilkins felt it, the undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The familiar creaks of the old house began to sound, different, as though the house itself was groaning in discomfort. And then there were the knocks. Quiet at first, barely noticeable, like the soft tapping of a fingernail against the wood, but growing louder as the nights passed. It started in the dead of night when the house was still. The first knock had been so faint that Mrs. Wilkins hadn't even turned her head, but as the nights wore on, the knocks grew more insistent. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the walls, always just outside her room. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the sound filling her ears, as if something or someone was knocking to be let in. At first she told herself it was just her imagination, or perhaps the wind rattling the windows. But the knocks persisted, following her through the house, in the kitchen, in the hallway, in the drawing room. They were always there, lurking just out of sight, like a ghostly visitor waiting for acknowledgement. One evening, as she sat in her sitting room, the fire crackling in the hearth, Mrs. Wilkins heard it again, 3 knocks, soft but distinct, coming from the hallway outside. She stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the door. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest, but she refused to be cowed by fear. Emily was gone, buried, forgotten. There was no such thing as ghosts. And yet, something was off. She stood up, straightening her back, and walked toward the door. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the shadows long and stretching across the floor, like dark fingers reaching for her. Mrs. Wilkins stood in the doorway for a moment, staring into the empty space beyond, waiting for something to reveal itself. But the hallway was silent still. Ridiculous, she muttered to herself, shaking her head as she turned back toward the fire. But as she crossed the threshold, a sharp, icy chill swept through her, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It felt as though a cold hand had brushed against her skin, lingering just long enough to make her shiver. She whipped around, her eyes wide and searching the shadows, but there was nothing, just a faint flicker of the candlelight casting strange, shifting shades along the walls. It wasn't just the knocks. The house itself seemed to groan in protest at times, as though the very wood and stone was straining under an invisible weight. Sometimes Mrs. Wilkins could swear she felt a presence behind her, watching her with cold, dead eyes. But every time she turned to look, there was nothing, only the echo of her own paranoia. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences grew worse. Doors creaked open on their own, footsteps could be heard pacing through the upstairs hallways late at night, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop unnaturally low after sunset. Mrs. Wilkins found herself waking up at odd hours, drenched in a cold sweat, her heart racing as if something had been standing over her bed, watching her as she slept. And then came the whispers. They started as barely audible murmurs, like the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. At first Mrs. Wilkins thought it was just the creaks of the old house settling, but soon she began to hear her name whispered in a voice that was unmistakably Emily's. It would call to her, soft and drawn out, always from the darkest corners of the house, "Mother." The word sent shivers down Mrs. Wilkins' spine. She began to dread the night time, when the house became a tomb of endless shadows and echoing sounds. Her iron will, once unshakable, was beginning to show cracks. She still refused to admit that something was wrong, even as the house closed in on her, making her feel suffocated and hunted. She would not acknowledge it, because to acknowledge it meant admitting that she was afraid, and Mrs. Wilkins had never been afraid of anything. But one night, everything changed. The storm that night was fierce, the wind howling through the trees outside, rain pelting the windows like small stones. Mrs. Wilkins lay in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the flickering light from the dying fire in the hearth, casting erratic shadows across the walls. She had almost convinced herself that she would get through the night without incident when she heard it a soft rustle, like fabric brushing against the floorboards. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up in bed, her eyes scanning the room. The air felt thick, almost tangible, as though the darkness itself had weight. Mrs. Wilkins' breath hitched as she saw it, the shadow. It stood at the end of the hallway just beyond her bedroom door, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakably there. A figure, unmoving, shrouded in darkness. The figure was slight, its posture slumped as though burdened by something too heavy to carry. For a moment, Mrs. Wilkins thought it was Henry. Perhaps he had finally broken under the weight of his grief. But as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized the truth, and a cold terror gripped her heart. It was Emily, or at least what was left of her. Emily's ghost stood in the hallway, her pale, translucent form barely illuminated by the faint light spilling from the bedroom. Her hair hung limply around her face, wet and stringy, as if she had just been pulled from a grave. But it was her eyes, those hollow, accusing eyes, that made Mrs. Wilkins' blood run cold. They were dark, empty, lifeless, staring straight at her, as though waiting for an explanation, an apology that would never come. Around Emily's neck, the bruises were still there, deep purple rings from the noose that had ended her life, the mark of her final torment. The sight of them twisted something deep inside Mrs. Wilkins, but she forced herself to stand, her hands trembling at her sides. "Emily," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible, even to herself. The ghost did not move. It simply stood there watching her, its presence filling the hallway with a coldness so intense that Mrs. Wilkins could see her own breath in the air. "This can't be real. I'm dreaming." Mrs. Wilkins clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to convince herself that what she was seeing wasn't real. But the figure remained, unmoving, unwavering, and those eyes, those cold, dead eyes, seemed to burn into her soul. The knocks echoed through the hallway again, 3 slow taps, reverberating through the stillness of the house. Emily's form flickered, as though caught in a gust of wind that did not exist, and then, slowly, she began to move. Step by step, Emily's ghost glided forward, her feet barely touching the ground as she approached Mrs. Wilkins. With every step, the air grew colder, the room darker, and Mrs. Wilkins felt her control slipping away. She backed up instinctively, her body trembling, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "Emily?" "No," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're dead. You're dead." The ghost didn't stop. It came closer until it was only inches from Mrs. Wilkins. Emily's face was pale and gaunt, her lips slightly parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Her hollow eyes bored into Mrs. Wilkins, filled with unspoken accusations, with the weight of the torment she had suffered in life and in death. For the first time in her life, Mrs. Wilkins felt true fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from the unknown, but a deep primal terror, the kind that sinks its claws into your heart and squeezes until you can't breathe. Her chest tightened, her knees weakened, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. Emily's lips moved, but the sound that came out was barely a whisper, a soft, chilling breath that carried a single word. Why, the question hung in the air, freezing Mrs. Wilkins in place. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, her mind reeling, but she had no answer. She had never cared enough to ask herself why she had treated Emily the way she had. She had never allowed herself to feel guilt. But now, faced with the specter of her daughter-in-law, she realized that Emily's suffering had not ended with her death. It had only just begun. The ghost's hand reached out, the fingers curling like claws, reaching for Mrs. Wilkins' throat, as if to return the pain she had endured. Mrs. Wilkins let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward, her hands flying up to protect herself. But there was nothing to stop. The ghost vanished, dissipating into the shadows like smoke. The hallway was empty once more, but the cold remained. The darkness clung to the walls, and Mrs. Wilkins knew this was just the beginning. Part 5. Escalating Terror. Mrs. Wilkins had always been a woman of unshakable resolve. She was not the type to succumb to fear or weakness. But the days following Emily's death had changed everything. The once stoic matriarch now found herself in a battle she could not win, a battle not of will or strength, but against something far more terrifying, Emily's vengeful spirit, and it was relentless. The haunting had started small subtle disturbances, eerie noises, and the constant unnerving sensation of being watched. But now, those small signs had morphed into a suffocating, ever-present terror. Emily's cold, dead presence was everywhere. Mrs. Wilkins could feel it in every room, in every corner of the house. It was as though the very walls had absorbed Emily's despair and rage, exhaling it back into the air with every passing moment. The house felt alive with hatred, and it was all directed at her. By day, Mrs. Wilkins tried to maintain her facade of control. She continued her daily routine, forcing herself to go through the motions of her once orderly life. But her nerves were unraveling. She could feel the cold prickling at her skin whenever she passed by Emily's old room. She avoided looking at the shadows too closely for fear that she might see Emily standing there, watching her with those hollow, accusing eyes. But it was at night when the true horror came. On one particular night, the air inside the house was heavy with tension, as if the very atmosphere was pregnant with something dark and malevolent. Mrs. Wilkins lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart beating a slow, erratic rhythm. The fire in her heart had burned down to embers, casting weak flickers of light across the room, barely holding the darkness at bay. She had not slept well in weeks. Her nights had become long, torturous hours of dread, filled with the fear of what might come if she closed her eyes for too long. She could sense Emily's presence more intensely with each passing night. It was as if Emily's ghost was growing stronger, feeding off her fear. As she lay there, the familiar sound of the wind howling outside reached her ears. It had become a regular companion in the night since Emily's death, as though the elements themselves were mourning the injustice that had taken place within the house. The ghost rattled the windows, but Mrs. Wilkins told herself it was nothing more than the storm passing through. But then something changed. The air in the room grew colder, unnaturally cold. Mrs. Wilkins felt it creeping up her arms and legs, seeping through her nightgown, chilling her to the bone. She reached for the blanket, pulling it tighter around herself, but the cold persisted. It was a cold that didn't come from the outside. It was something else, something otherworldly. A sudden sharp knock echoed from the far side of the room, startling her. It was louder this time, more insistent, like something demanding to be let in. So, Mrs. Wilkins' heart raced as she sat up in bed, her eyes darting around the room. The faint light from the fire barely illuminated the dark corners, but she could feel the weight of Emily's presence in the shadows. It pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. The knock came again, this time accompanied by a gust of freezing wind that blew through the room, making the curtains flutter violently. Her breath caught in her throat as the window across the room burst open with a deafening crash, sending shards of glass clatter into the floor. The wind howled through the opening, whipping through the room like the wail of a banshee. And then she saw it hurt. Emily's ghost stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakably there. Her pale form was shrouded in darkness, her hair hanging limply around her face, soaked as if she had just emerged from some watery grave. The bruises on her neck deep, angry purple marks stood out starkly against her white skin, a reminder of the noose that had taken her life. But it was her eyes that sent Mrs. Wilkins into a spiral of terror. Emily's lifeless eyes, once hollow and distant, now burned with a hatred that Mrs. Wilkins could feel in her very soul. They were locked on her, unblinking, filled with the fury of someone who had been wronged beyond measure. Those eyes bored into her, as if they could see every dark secret, every cruel word, every ounce of malice Mrs. Wilkins had ever harbored toward her daughter-in-law. "Emily," Mrs. Wilkins whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the roaring wind. Her throat was dry, her mouth parched as if the very air had been stolen from her lungs. The ghost didn't move. It simply stood there, staring, as the wind swirled around the room, lifting the edges of Emily's dress in an unnatural, spectral way. Her feet hovered just above the floor, as if she were caught between this world and the next, bound by the hatred that anchored her here. Mrs. Wilkins' breath quickened. Her heart pounded in her chest as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Emily had returned. She had come back for revenge. "Go away," Mrs. Wilkins choked out, her voice barely more than a whimper. She scrambled to the edge of the bed, her body trembling violently. "Leave me alone," but Emily didn't leave. Instead, she began to move. It was slow at first, a subtle shifting in the shadows, as if her form was still deciding whether or not it should fully materialize. But then she started gliding forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Wilkins. The room seemed to darken around her, the shadows bending and twisting as if drawn to the cold energy radiating from the ghost. "No, please," Mrs. Wilkins gasped back, her voice barely recognizable through the fear constricting her throat. She backed up further onto the bed, pressing her back against the headboard, her hands clutching the blanket in a death grip. "You're dead. You can't, Tom." This isn't real, but it was real. The ghost was real, and it was coming for her. Emily's form flickered, her face twisting into something grotesque, something inhuman. The bruises on her neck seemed to pulse, darkening as she came closer, as though they were alive with her anger. Her lips parted, and from the depths of her throat came a sound low, guttural, like the wind howling through a graveyard. It was the sound of suffering, of torment, of revenge. Mrs. Wilkins screamed. She hadn't meant to, but the sound ripped out of her before she could stop it. The scream filled the room, drowning out the wind, but it didn't stop Emily's approach. The ghost was relentless, its cold, dead fingers reaching out as it neared the bed. Mrs. Wilkins could feel the temperature drop even further as Emily drew closer, and with it came the crushing weight of all the wrong she had inflicted on her daughter-in-law. "Emily, I'm sorry," she cried, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. She pressed herself against the headboard, trying to put as much distance between herself and the ghost as possible. "Please, forgive me." But there was no forgiveness in Emily's eyes. Only anger, only vengeance. The wind howled louder, the curtains whipping violently as Emily reached the foot of the bed. Her form flickered again, her once beautiful face now a ghastly mask of death, her eyes hollow and sunken, her skin stretched tight over her bones. The smell of decay filled the air, mingling with the cold, as if death itself had taken up residence in the room. Mrs. Wilkins felt her chest tighten, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could feel the darkness closing in on her, pressing down on her chest, squeezing the life from her. She clutched at her throat, her fingers trembling as she fought to breathe. It was as if an invisible hand was choking her, just as Emily had been choked by the noose. And then, without warning, Emily's ghost lunged. Mrs. Wilkins let out a strangled cry as Emily's cold, dead hands wrapped around her throat, squeezing with a strength that no spirit should have. Her fingers were like iron, unyielding, as they tightened around Mrs. Wilkins' neck, cutting off her air. The room spun, and black spots danced in her vision as the pressure increased, her lungs burning for air. The ghost's face loomed inches from hers, its dead eyes staring into her soul. Mrs. Wilkins could feel the hatred radiating from Emily, a hatred so intense it seemed to burn her from the inside out. She could feel her strength fading, her consciousness slipping away as the cold darkness swallowed her whole. Just as she thought she would lose herself completely, Emily's voice, soft and chilling, echoed in her ear. "You will suffer," and with that the ghost vanished. The hands around her throat disappeared, and Mrs. Wilkins collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. The cold in the room lingered, but the darkness had receded, leaving her alone in the flickering light of the dying fire. Tears streamed down her face, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had never felt such terror in her life. She knew deep down that this was only the beginning. Emily had come back for revenge, and she wouldn't stop until she had taken everything from her. Mrs. Wilkins lay there, sobbing into the darkness, knowing that there was no escape from the torment that awaited her. Emily's ghost was out there waiting, and it would return. Part 6. Descent into Madness. The house that once echoed with Mrs. Wilkins' authoritative footsteps and booming commands now vibrated with an unbearable, suffocating tension. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as if the house itself had become a living thing, feeding off the terror that now consumed her. Emily's spirit had taken root, and Mrs. Wilkins could no longer pretend she had control not over her household, not over herself. In the daylight hours, Mrs. Wilkins still attempted to cling to her authority, though it had become a hollow mockery of her former self. She still barked orders at the servants, her voice cracking with a thin veneer of strength, but they had begun to notice the changes in her. There was a wildness in her eyes now, a constant, twitching vigilance, as if she were always looking over her shoulder. Her once meticulously neat appearance had deteriorated. Her hair, usually perfectly pinned, hung in disarray, and her clothes were rumpled as though she had forgotten how to care for herself. Fear had hollowed her out, leaving only a shell of the iron-willed matriarch she had once been. But it was at night that her descent into madness truly took hold. The nights had become a living nightmare, an inescapable purgatory where sleep was a distant memory. Each time Mrs. Wilkins closed her eyes, she would jolt awake moments later, drenched in cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest as though trying to break free from her ribs. She could feel Emily's presence more strongly now, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as she lay trembling in her bed, the voices started. At first they were faint, barely more than whispers carried on the wind, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to rise and fall with the flickering shadows on the walls. Mrs. Wilkins squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the blankets to her chest, hoping the voices would fade. But they didn't. Mother, the voice, soft and ethereal, drifted through the air like a cold breeze. Mrs. Wilkins' eyes shot open, her breath catching in her throat. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering in her ears. The voice was unmistakably Emily's. Mother. Why the question lingered in the air, a ghostly echo that sent shivers down Mrs. Wilkins' spine. Her hand shook violently as she clutched the edge of the blanket, her knuckles white. She scanned the room, her gaze darting from corner to corner, searching for the source of the voice. There was no one there. But the shadows seemed to deepen, the room growing colder with every passing second. The darkness seemed alive, undulating, twisting itself into shapes just beyond her comprehension. Mrs. Wilkins could feel the walls closing in on her, the space growing tighter, as if the house itself was conspiring to smother her. Please, please leave me alone, she whimpered, her voice cracking. You're dead. You shouldn't be here. The cold laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, and unmistakably Emily's. It echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, reverberating in Mrs. Wilkins' mind like the tolling of a death bell. No, Mrs. Wilkins gasped, clutching her chest as her breathing grew shallow and frantic. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But it was real. The cold grip of Emily's presence was as tangible as the icy wind that howled outside. Mrs. Wilkins stumbled out of bed, her legs trembling as she made her way toward the door, desperate to flee the suffocating confines of her room. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and every breath felt like she was inhaling the very essence of Emily's anger. She fumbled with the doorknob, her fingers numb and shaking. Her mind screamed for her to escape, to leave the house and never return, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself had locked her in, trapping her with the ghost that now ruled over it. "Let me out," Mrs. Wilkins cried, slamming her fists against the door. But her strength, once so formidable, had been drained by fear. The door remained stubbornly shut, sealing her fate inside the haunted room. Suddenly she felt it an icy grip on her arm. Mrs. Wilkins froze, her breath catching in her throat as the cold fingers tightened around her wrist. It felt as though death itself had reached out and wrapped its hand around her. Slowly, with trembling terror, she turned her head. Emily stood behind her. Her ghostly form was fully materialized now, more real than it had ever been. The bruises around her neck were darker, deeper, almost black against her pale, translucent skin. Her dress, still stained from the night of her death, clung to her body as though soaked in an invisible rain. But it was her face, her twisted, ghastly face, that sent Mrs. Wilkins spiraling into hysteria. Emily's eyes, once empty and hollow, now glowed with a burning fury. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, a mocking, vengeful grin that sent waves of nausea roiling through Mrs. Wilkins' stomach. And then, with deliberate slowness, Emily began to pull her. "No, no," Mrs. Wilkins screamed, pulling back, struggling with all her might to free herself from Emily's cold grip. But the ghost was strong, stronger than anything Mrs. Wilkins had ever faced in life. Emily's cold, dead fingers tightened around her wrist, dragging her back toward the bed, back into the heart of the nightmare. Mrs. Wilkins stumbled, her knees buckling as she fought against the force pulling her. But it was futile. Emily's strength was unyielding, and Mrs. Wilkins could feel the room itself growing darker, the walls bending and shifting like the inside of a tomb. She was being pulled back into the very bed where Emily had suffered under her cruelty, back into the very space where Emily's life had been snuffed out. "Please," Mrs. Wilkins sobbed dead, her voice breaking as she collapsed to the floor, still struggling against the spectral grip. "Please, Emily. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," but the ghost said nothing. Emily's twisted smile never wavered as she pulled her mother-in-law closer, her cold breath whispering through the air like a death sentence. Mrs. Wilkins could feel the coldness creeping up her arm, seeping into her bones, draining her of life, of sanity. The world around her seemed to tilt, the room spinning as her vision blurred, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the cold grip released her. Mrs. Wilkins crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, her body shaking uncontrollably. She lay there, staring up at the ceiling, her mind reeling from the horror of what had just happened. But she knew this wasn't over. Emily wasn't done with her. Not yet. As she lay on the cold, hard floor, her vision swimming, the voices returned. "Mother," it was softer now, but closer, so close that it felt as though Emily were whispering directly into her ear. Mrs. Wilkins squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying up to cover her ears in a desperate attempt to block out the sound. "Why, Mother? Why did you do it, Mrs.?" Wilkins screamed, her voice raw and guttural, but it was drowned out by the sound of Emily's ghostly laughter, cold, mocking, and filled with a rage that shook the very foundations of the house. She stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding erratically in her chest. Her mind was fraying at the edges, unraveling under the weight of the fear and guilt that Emily had brought back from beyond the grave. Mrs. Wilkins staggered toward the window, her fingers clawing at the frame as though she could escape through it, as though she could flee from the nightmare that had taken hold of her. But there was no escape. Emily was everywhere, her voice, her presence, her cold, dead fingers that seemed to reach out from every shadow, from every corner of the room. Mrs. Wilkins could feel her sanity slipping away, falling into the abyss of terror that Emily had opened beneath her. The nights blurred together after that, each one worse than the last. Mrs. Wilkins began to see Emily even in the daylight hours, her ghostly form flickering in and out of view, as if teasing her, tormenting her. She could no longer trust her own mind. Every time she turned around, she expected to see Emily standing behind her, waiting to drag her back into the darkness. Her servants had begun to whisper among themselves, their eyes filled with fear and pity as they watched their once imposing mistress fall apart. Mrs. Wilkins could see it in their faces, the looks they exchanged when they thought she wasn't watching. They could sense the madness creeping in, and it terrified them. One evening, as Mrs. Wilkins sat in her once cherished parlor, staring blankly at the flickering flames in the fireplace, she heard it again, the soft knock on the door. She tensed, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling. The door creaked open slowly, and there she was. Emily's ghost standing in the doorway, her face twisted in that same grotesque smile, her eyes burning with an otherworldly hatred. Mrs. Wilkins' mind snapped. She screamed a piercing, bone-chilling scream that echoed through the entire house. She stumbled out of the chair, knocking over the small table beside her as she tried to flee, but her legs were too weak, too unsteady. She collapsed to the floor, crawling backward as Emily's ghost slowly advanced on her. The room grown colder with every step. "Please, Mrs. Wilkins," begged, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Please, leave me alone." But there was no mercy in Emily's eyes, only vengeance. And as the darkness closed in around her, Mrs. Wilkins knew that her sanity was lost. Part 7. The Vengeful Confrontation. The night was thick with a cold that cut straight through to the bone, seeping into the very walls of the Wilkins household. The oppressive silence within the house was broken only by the ticking of an old clock, its methodical beat a grim reminder of time's slow, inevitable march. For Mrs. Wilkins, time had become an enemy, each tick a step closer to the dark horrors that now ruled her life. She sat in her room, her body frail, her once imperious posture hunched over, as if the weight of her own guilt pressed down upon her. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the sides of her chair, the firelight flickering weakly before her, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Every flicker, every shift in the light sent her heart racing, her eyes darting around the room, waiting, expecting no, dreading Emily's return. There was no peace. Not anymore. Mrs. Wilkins had barely slept in weeks. When she closed her eyes, Emily was there. When she opened them, Emily was waiting. Her mind, once sharp and calculating, had unraveled under the relentless pressure of the haunting. She had fought to maintain control over her life, but now that control was shattered. She was no longer the iron-willed matriarch, she was a terrified woman, hunted by a force far more powerful than anything she had ever faced. Tonight, though, felt different. The air was heavier, colder, more suffocating. It felt as though the walls of the house were closing in on her, pressing in on her from all sides, trapping her in the suffocating darkness of her guilt. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight with anxiety as the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes like the wail of some tormented soul. And then the room grew deathly quiet. The wind stilled, the clock stopped ticking, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, as if absorbing all the light from the room. Mrs. Wilkins' heart stilled. The cold crept up her spine, a chill that wasn't from the room, but from something far more sinister. She felt it, the unmistakable presence of death. Emily was here. She didn't have to look to know it, she could feel her. The air grew thick with an icy weight, and her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, no hunted. The fire suddenly sputtered out, leaving the room bathed in a suffocating darkness. Mrs. Wilkins clutched the armrest of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she strained her ears for any sound, any sign of movement. And then she heard it, a voice, low, cold, and unmistakably filled with hatred. "Mother," the word echoed through the room, cold and sharp, slicing through the silence like a knife. It was a voice from the grave, chilling and hollow, and it carried with it the weight of all the suffering Emily had endured. Mrs. Wilkins' breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place as the voice continued. "Mother, why did you do it?" The words were filled with pain, with accusation. Mrs. Wilkins could feel the air around her grow colder. as if Emily's presence was draining all warmth, all life from the room. "No, no." It wasn't like that, Mrs. Wilkins stammered, her voice trembling as she spoke. But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. They were excuses, lies she had told herself to justify the cruelty she had inflicted. There was no escaping the truth now. A shadow stirred in the corner of the room, and Mrs. Wilkins' eyes widened in terror as Emily's ghost emerged from the darkness. She moved slowly, deliberately, her once beautiful face now a grotesque mask of death. The bruises around her neck stood out starkly against her pale, translucent skin, deep and purple, a permanent reminder of the rope that had ended her life. Emily's eyes, those cold, dead eyes, locked onto Mrs. Wilkins, filled with an unearthly fury. Her lips curled into a cruel smile, twisted and mocking. "You took everything from me," Emily whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally in the darkened room. "You made my life a living hell, and now I have come to return the favor." Mrs. Wilkins' heart pounded in her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged as she stared at the ghostly figure before her. There was no warmth in Emily's eyes, no trace of the timid, frightened girl she had once been. This was something else, something filled with rage and vengeance, a force born of suffering and death. "Emily, please," Mrs. Wilkins gasped, her voice shaking as she tried to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. "I didn't mean," Emily's voice cut her off, sharp and venomous. She took a step closer, her figure flickering in and out of the shadows as she moved. "You meant every cruel word, every hateful glance. You wanted me to suffer, and I did." The coldness in the room grew unbearable, pressing in on Mrs. Wilkins from all sides, suffocating her with the weight of her own guilt. She staggered back, stumbling over her own feet, as she tried to put distance between herself and the ghost. But no matter how far she moved, Emily was always there, closing in, her dead eyes burning with fury. "You killed me," Mother Emily whispered, her voice like ice. "You may not have tied the noose, but you killed me just the same. You killed me with your cruelty, your hatred, your heartless indifference." Mrs. Wilkins collapsed against the wall, her back pressed against the cold surface as her legs gave out beneath her. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she stared into the face of the woman she had tormented for so many years. "I'm sorry," she choked, her voice barely a whisper. Tears streamed down her face, but they did nothing to soften the ghost's fury. "Please, I'm so sorry," but Emily only laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the room like the tolling of a funeral bell. It was a laugh devoid of mercy, devoid of forgiveness. Sorry, Emily spat, her smile twisting into something even more grotesque. "You think that will save you? You think your tears will wash away what you've done?" She moved closer, her form flickering like a dying flame, the shadows bending and twisting around her, as if they too were under her control. Mrs. Wilkins could feel the cold radiating from Emily's ghost, a cold that seemed to seep into her very bones, freezing her from the inside out. "There is no forgiveness for what you've done," Emily whispered, her voice so close now that Mrs. Wilkins could feel the icy breath on her skin. "You didn't allow me a moment of peace in life, and now I will never allow you peace in death." Mrs. Wilkins' eyes widened in horror as Emily's cold, translucent hand reached out toward her. She tried to move, tried to scream, but her body was paralyzed with terror. The ghost's fingers wrapped around her wrist, and instantly a shock of cold shot through her body, so intense that it felt like knives stabbing into her flesh. "No, no, please," Mrs. Wilkins whimpered, her voice barely audible as she tried to pull away from the ghostly grip. But Emily was relentless. "You will suffer as I suffered," Emily hissed, her grip tightening as her other hand slowly rose to Mrs. Wilkins' throat. "You will know what it feels like to be trapped." Helpless, powerless, the icy fingers closed around Mrs. Wilkins' throat, and her breath caught in her chest. Her hands flew up to claw at the ghostly fingers, but they passed straight through them, unable to stop the suffocating pressure. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as the coldness spread through her body. Emily's face was inches from hers now, her dead, empty eyes boring into her soul. "You took my life," Emily whispered, her voice filled with a deadly calm. "Now I will take yours," the room spun as Mrs. Wilkins' world began to collapse around her. The cold was unbearable, the pressure on her throat suffocating, and she could feel her strength fading. Her mind spiraled into darkness, a darkness that was filled with Emily's accusing voice, with the ghost's cold, mocking laughter. And just as Mrs. Wilkins thought she would slip into oblivion, Emily released her. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her hands clutching her throat as she choked and coughed. The coldness lingered in the air, and though Emily's ghost had stepped back, the fury in her eyes remained. "This is only the beginning," Emily whispered, her voice low and deadly. "You will never know peace. Not in this life, not in death. I will be with you always, watching, waiting, until you beg for the release that will never come." Mrs. Wilkins' sobs filled the room, her body shaking uncontrollably as she lay crumpled on the floor, broken and defeated. She knew now there was no escape, not from Emily, not from the past, not from the torment that would haunt her for the rest of her days. And as Emily's ghost faded back into the shadows, leaving the room cold and silent once more, Mrs. Wilkins realized the terrible truth. This was her punishment. This was her eternal sentence. And Emily would make sure she paid for it every single day. Part 8. The final moments. The storm outside raged with a ferocity that seemed to mirror the chaos inside Mrs. Wilkins' crumbling mind. The wind howled through the trees, their branches clawing at the windows like bony fingers, and the rain lashed against the house in relentless sheets. Thunder cracked violently overhead, shaking the very foundations of the once grand home, but none of it compared to the storm that had taken root within the walls of her own house, within the walls of her own soul. Mrs. Wilkins' heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled down the dark hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had never known fear like this. Every corner she turned, every shadow she passed, felt alive, watching her, waiting for the moment to strike. And she knew deep down, in the pit of her soul, that Emily's ghost was close, too close. She could feel it. The cold, unnatural chill that had settled over the house, growing colder with each passing moment. It was as though Emily had drawn the very warmth from the air, leaving only a frigid, deathly silence in her wake. "I have to get out. I have to leave this house," Mrs. Wilkins whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she reached out to steady herself against the wall. But the plaster was damp cold, and her hand recoiled at the icy touch. She could hear it, Emily's soft, almost imperceptible footsteps behind her. It was a sound so faint, like the whisper of the wind, but it carried with it a weight that made Mrs. Wilkins' blood run cold. Her chest tightened with panic as she looked over her shoulder, expecting to see Emily's ghost standing in the shadows, her dead eyes burning with fury. But there was nothing, only darkness. Still, the sensation of being watched never left her. Mrs. Wilkins knew Emily was near, always near. Without wasting another second, she hurried down the hallway, her footsteps echoing against the walls as she made her way toward the front door. It was her only chance, her only hope. If she could just leave the house, escape into the storm, maybe, just maybe, she could outrun the nightmare that had taken hold of her life. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, groaning as though the house itself was protesting her escape. The familiar hallway, once a symbol of her power and dominance, now felt like a suffocating trap. The walls seemed to lean in on her, the ceiling pressing down, as if the house had become a living, breathing entity, conspiring against her. Her heart raced as she finally reached the front door, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the lock. Her hands were slick with sweat, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she struggled to free herself from the house. "Please," she gasped, her voice a desperate whisper. "Let me out." Her fingers clawed at the lock, twisting and pulling, but it refused to give. The door, heavy and unyielding, stood like an impenetrable wall between her and freedom. Her panic escalated, her hand slipping on the brass knob as she yanked harder, her desperation growing with each failed attempt. Suddenly a soft, icy whisper filled the room, Leaving so soon, Mother? The voice froze her in place. Mrs. Wilkins' heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, almost as though compelled by some unseen force, she turned her head. Emily's ghost stood at the far end of the hallway, her figure faintly illuminated by the flashes of lightning that streaked across the sky. The bruises around her neck were darker now, more pronounced, and her eyes glowed with a cold, otherworldly fury. Mrs. Wilkins staggered back, her hands flying up to her chest, as though to shield herself from the vengeful spirit. No, please, she stammered, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted. Emily's lips twisted into a cruel smile. You didn't mean for it to happen, she echoed, her voice soft but dripping with venom. You didn't want me to suffer, but you did, Mother. You made sure of it. The coldness in the air intensified, and Mrs. Wilkins could feel it creeping up her legs, wrapping around her like invisible chains, rooting her to the spot. She tried to move, but her body felt as though it had turned to stone, frozen in place by the sheer weight of Emily's presence. I, Mrs. Wilkins could barely speak, her voice little more than a strangled gasp. The terror that coursed through her veins was unlike anything she had ever known. Emily took a step closer, her dead eyes never leaving Mrs. Wilkins. You made my life hell, Emily whispered, her voice laced with a quiet fury that sent shivers down Mrs. Wilkins' spine. You watched me suffer, and you did nothing. You revel in my pain. I didn't. Mrs. Wilkins cried, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean it, Emily. I was just cruel. Emily finished, her voice cold and merciless. You were cruel, Mrs. Wilkins sobbed, her knees buckling as she collapsed to the floor, her hands outstretched in a pitiful plea for mercy. Please, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but there was no mercy in Emily's dead eyes. I suffered in that room night after night, Emily said, her voice now a low growl. I begged for death, and when it finally came, you didn't even care. You cast me aside like I was nothing. Emily's ghost was closer now, so close that Mrs. Wilkins could feel the icy chill radiating from her translucent form. The air around her grew impossibly cold, her breath visible in the dark room as it puffed out in trembling gasps. I won't let you leave, Mother, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. Not until you've paid. Suddenly, Emily's cold, ghostly hand shot out, gripping Mrs. Wilkins by the wrist with an iron-like grip. Mrs. Wilkins screamed, the icy touch sending waves of agony coursing through her body. The cold was unbearable, freezing her bones, sapping her strength. No, Mrs. Wilkins cried, struggling to break free, but Emily's ghost was too strong. She pulled Mrs. Wilkins to her feet, dragging her back down the hallway, away from the door, away from any hope of escape. Mrs. Wilkins' screams filled the house, but they were drowned out by the storm that raged outside. Thunder boomed overhead, and the wind howled like the cries of the damned. It was as though the very elements had conspired to trap her, to smother her cries for help. Help me, Mrs. Wilkins screamed, her voice breaking as she clawed at the walls, trying to anchor herself, trying to resist the ghostly force that pulled her deeper into the house. But there was no one to help, no one to hear her. The house had become a prison, a tomb that would entrap her forever. Emily dragged her relentlessly, her grip like ice, pulling her toward the very room where she had died. Mrs. Wilkins' legs buckled beneath her as she was dragged, her nails scraping against the floor in a desperate attempt to stop the inevitable. But there was no stopping it, no escape. Emily's ghost pulled her into the room, the door slamming shut behind them with a deafening crack that echoed through the house. The storm outside grew louder, the wind battering the windows as though it too was part of the vengeful forces that had come for Mrs. Wilkins. The room was unbearably cold, the air thick with Emily's presence. Mrs. Wilkins collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with terror and exhaustion. She tried to crawl away, to escape the cold, to escape the nightmare, but Emily's ghost hovered above her, her dead eyes glowing with hatred. You will never leave this house, Mother, Emily whispered, her voice a low hiss. You will never know peace, not in this life, not in death. Mrs. Wilkins whimpered, curling into herself as though she could hide from the horror that stood before her. But there was no hiding, no escape. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like a banshee, drowning out the sound of Mrs. Wilkins' sobs. The walls of the room seemed to close in, suffocating her, trapping her with the ghost that would haunt her for the rest of her days. And as Emily's cold fingers brushed against her cheek, Mrs. Wilkins realized, with a bone-deep certainty, that this was her end. The ghost's final words echoed in her mind, filling the room with a cold, inescapable truth you will never rest. And as the storm outside reached its peak, Mrs. Wilkins' final scream was lost in the wind, drowned out by the wrath of the vengeful spirit who would never, ever let her go. Part 9. A Haunting Legacy. The Wilkins household stood eerily quiet in the aftermath of Mrs. Wilkins' final, terrifying moments. Outside, the storm had subsided, leaving behind only the soft patter of rain on the windows and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. But inside, the house felt different. The air was thick with a cold that seemed to seep into the very walls, a chill that could never be warmed by any fire. Mrs. Wilkins' body lay crumpled on the floor of Emily's old room, her once commanding presence reduced to a hollow shell. Her face, twisted in fear, was frozen in a final scream, her eyes wide and empty, staring into nothingness. Her lips were parted, as if she had been trying to beg for mercy in those final moments, but no words had come. All that remained was the haunting silence. Emily's vengeance had been fulfilled. The door to the room hung ajar, swaying gently with the wind that leaked through the cracks in the window. It was as though the house itself was breathing alive with the dark energy that now consumed it. The shadows in the corner seemed to deepen, shifting and moving, as if something lingered just beyond the edge of perception. And in the silence, one could still feel Emily's presence. She was there watching, waiting, her ghostly form now at peace, but only in the most sinister sense. She had exacted her revenge, but her spirit had not moved on. No, Emily had no intention of leaving the Wilkins home. It was hers now, and it would remain hers for as long as her bitter soul held sway. Emily's cold, vengeful touch had left its mark on the house, and no one would ever be able to erase it. The Wilkins family had once been a proud, powerful clan, with Mrs. Wilkins ruling over them all like a queen. But now the matriarch was gone, and her reign had ended not in a quiet passing or a dignified farewell, but in terror, in madness, and in death. Her cruelty had finally come back to claim her, and she had paid the ultimate price. Her downfall had been written in the lines of Emily's suffering, each act of cruelty carving out the path that led to this moment. The years of torment, the cold, heartless indifference, every whispered insult, every sneer had added to the weight that now crushed the once proud Mrs. Wilkins beneath the cold gaze of her wronged daughter-in-law. But Emily's vengeance did not end with Mrs. Wilkins' death. No, her revenge extended far beyond that single, climactic moment. The house itself had become a monument to Emily's pain, a living testament to the suffering she had endured. It had been poisoned by the hate, the cruelty, and now the supernatural force that lingered within its walls ensured that no one in the Wilkins family would ever know peace again. The servants who had once gone about their duties with quiet reverence now moved through the house with a palpable sense of dread. The Wilkins name, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now whispered with fear. No one wanted to stay in the house for long. There were whispers among the staff, rumors of cold spots, of strange noises in the night, of shadows that moved when no one was watching. They spoke in hushed tones about the eerie feeling that crept over them whenever they passed by Emily's room, where the door would never quite stay closed no matter how many times it was shut. Henry, Mrs. Wilkins' son and Emily's widower, was perhaps the most affected. He had always been a weak man, too cowed by his mother's oppressive control to stand up for his wife, too fearful to confront the cruelty that had poisoned their home. But now, with his mother dead and Emily's ghost haunting every corner of the house, Henry found himself spiraling into despair. The guilt weighed heavily on him. He had not protected Emily in life, and now in death, her spirit would not let him forget it. He could feel her presence in every room, could sense her eyes on him whenever he closed his own. At night he could hear her whispering his name, soft and accusing, a reminder of the life they had never had, the peace he had denied her. Henry, her voice would drift through the air, a whisper carried on the wind, filling his mind with the memories of the nights he had left her alone, abandoned to his mother's cruelty. He had pretended not to hear her cries then, but now there was no escaping her voice. It followed him everywhere, a constant reminder of his failure as a husband, as a man. The other members of the family, too, found themselves caught in the web of Emily's vengeance. They would visit the house, trying to make sense of the tragedy, but none could stay for long. They would feel it, the cold, the weight of Emily's presence, the oppressive atmosphere that clung to every room, every hallway. The house had become a mausoleum, a place where Emily's spirit reigned, and none dared challenge her. No one could. Visitors would come, but they would not stay. They spoke of strange happenings, of the unsettling feeling that someone was always watching. There were stories of doors slamming shut on their own, of windows that wouldn't open no matter how hard they tried, of furniture moving slightly out of place when no one was looking. And then there were the footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. They would echo through the halls at night, the sound of Emily's ghost walking through the house, reminding everyone that she was still there. The Wilkins family, once proud and prosperous, had been shattered. Emily's death had marked the beginning of their downfall, and her haunting ensured that they would never recover. The house, once a symbol of their wealth and power, now stood as a dark reminder of the consequences of cruelty. Years passed, but the haunting never ceased. Servants came and went, but none stayed long enough to grow comfortable. The family dwindled, their fortunes fading along with their once great name. The house too began to fall into disrepair. The walls, once pristine, were now cracked and worn. The floors creaked with age, and the windows, once polished to a shine, were now clouded with dust. But still, Emily's ghost remained. She was there in the shadows, watching, waiting. Her presence, though silent, was suffocating. The cold spots in the house grew more frequent, the strange occurrences more intense. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it. The house was alive with Emily's spirit, and it would never let go of the past. Emily's vengeance had not been limited to Mrs. Wilkins. It had extended to the entire Wilkins family, ensuring that none of them would ever know peace again. The haunting legacy of the wrong daughter-in-law had taken root, and it had consumed them all. And so the once grand Wilkins estate became a place of whispers, a house where no one dared stay after dark, where the ghosts of the past ruled over the living. The family's fortunes faded, their influence waned, and soon they were little more than a footnote in history, a family brought to ruin, not by external forces, but by the darkness within their own walls. Emily had claimed her revenge, and in the end it was she who had the final word. For as long as the house stood, her ghost would remain, a reminder of the price of cruelty, of the consequences of heartlessness. And her whisper, soft and cold, would echo through the halls for eternity. No one will ever forget the Wilkins household, once a symbol of power, was now a tomb forever haunted by the ghost of a woman wronged, forever cursed by the legacy of vengeance she left behind.